Sloane Harrington stood in the aisle of the private jet and threw Grant Holloway's jacket onto the carpet, then told the flight attendant in a voice cold enough to frost the windows to remove her ex-husband from her flight. The executives behind her laughed, certain the man in the plain gray coat had wandered somewhere he did not belong. Grant only asked quietly if she was sure she wanted to humiliate him in front of the entire crew. Sloane smiled the way she used to smile before signing a contract she had already decided to break, and told him that a man like him did not belong anywhere near an $80 million cabin. Just as the door began to close, the captain stepped out of the cockpit, looked at her, and said the four words that would end her morning. If you want to watch a woman built on arrogance finally meet the man she underestimated for 12 years, stay until the very end of this story. Grant Holloway arrived at Northridge Airfield in a pickup truck with 210,000 miles on the odometer, wearing a dark canvas jacket that had seen better winters, and carrying a single duffel bag he refused to hand to anyone else. He wore no watch, no rings, nothing that announced wealth, because he had long ago decided that the men who needed jewelry to prove their worth were usually the ones who had the least of it to begin with. Before boarding, he crouched beside the landing gear with a young maintenance technician named Owen and pointed out a hairline stress mark near the strut that the morning inspection had missed entirely. He spoke about tolerances and fatigue cycles with the fluency of a man who had built his life inside hangars, and Owen listened the way apprentices listen to someone they already suspect is smarter than their supervisor. None of the 6 Blackthorn global executives filing past noticed any of this. To them, the man crouched by the wheel was simply staff, invisible in the way that people in work jackets are always invisible to people who fly for a living. The morning air smelled of jet fuel and rain that had not quite decided to fall, and somewhere beyond the fence line a smaller aircraft coughed to life and taxied toward the runway. Grant straightened up slowly, brushing grit from his knees, and thanked Owen for flagging the anomaly before it ever became a problem worth worrying about. He had built his entire company on exactly this kind of attention, the habit of noticing small things before they became large ones, and he had never once believed that habit belonged only to men in expensive suits. There was a particular satisfaction in mornings like this, quiet and unremarkable, the kind that never made headlines but kept people alive 30,000 feet above the ground. He checked his watch, an old steel piece with a scratched face that had belonged to his father, and calculated that he had perhaps 10 minutes before the rest of the passengers arrived, and the day stopped being simple. Sloane arrived a few minutes later at the center of her small procession, already reviewing notes on her tablet for the $400 million meeting in Seattle, the one meant to save her company and, not incidentally, her career. She believed the Gulfstream waiting on the tarmac had been chartered by Conrad Blackthorn himself, a small luxury extended to his most trusted strategist before the biggest pitch of her professional life. When she saw Grant standing near the stairs, her first expression was not surprise, but irritation, the look of a woman discovering an old stain on a new dress. She asked sharply how he had even gotten past security, as though his presence were a kind of trespass that needed explaining. Grant answered simply that his name was on the manifest, and Sloane decided immediately that he must have used their old connection to beg his way onto a flight he had no business being near. In front of her colleagues, she reminded everyone that her ex-husband used to work out of a rented hangar, fixing other people's engines, painting a picture of a man who had never once climbed higher than a mechanic's stool. She told him, not quietly at all, that he should go back to his garage and his small little life, instead of pretending he belonged among people who ran real companies. Grant did not argue. He only asked her, calmly, if she was certain this was her flight. And Sloane mistook the question for jealousy, for the bitterness of a man watching her ex-husband succeed without him. She ordered the flight attendant to walk him off the plane, and the woman hesitated only a moment before reaching for his jacket where it had fallen to the floor. The cockpit door opened and Captain Reese Callahan stepped into the cabin with the unhurried authority of a man who had flown for 30 years and answered to exactly one person on Earth. He looked down at the jacket crumpled on the carpet, then at Sloane, then back at the jacket, and asked her why she was ordering the owner of the aircraft removed from his own airplane. The cabin lights hummed faintly overhead, and somewhere near the galley a coffee maker clicked off, filling the silence with something warm and ordinary, while the moment itself turned anything but. Sloane's tablet, still open to her rehearsed talking points, seemed suddenly small in her hands, a prop from a scene that had just been rewritten without her permission. She glanced at the other executives, half expecting one of them to laugh and confirm this was some elaborate misunderstanding, but every face around her had gone carefully, deliberately blank, the particular blankness of people recalculating who holds power in a room. Reese did not repeat himself. He simply waited, like pilots wait for weather to clear, patient and entirely unbothered by the discomfort filling the cabin around him. Sloane laughed, assuming it was some kind of joke, or perhaps a case of mistaken identity between two men who happened to share a common surname. She told the captain, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child, that Blackthorn Global had chartered this jet for the trip to Seattle, and that whoever this man was, he was not part of her company's arrangement. Reese explained, without raising his voice, that Blackthorn Global had chartered nothing at all, that Holloway Meridian Aviation had offered the flight as a courtesy ahead of the very meeting she was preparing for. Still, Sloane could not connect the man standing quietly by the window to a company whose name had circled her industry for years without a face attached to it. She assumed out loud that this was simply a coincidence of last names, the kind of thing that happens in a world full of common surnames and small misunderstandings. Reese corrected her plainly, calling him by his full title, Mr. Holloway, registered owner of the aircraft carrying the tail number November 701 Golf, Hotel. And for the first time since boarding, the cabin went completely silent. One of the executives who had laughed loudest minutes earlier now bent down, picked up the discarded jacket, and brushed it off before returning it to Grant, who accepted it without comment and without cruelty. Sloane tried to recover, suggesting perhaps he was only a figurehead, someone who had borrowed money or lent his name to a wealthier investor behind the scenes, because the alternative was too disorienting to accept all at once. Grant said nothing to that either. He simply asked Reese to prepare for departure, reminding everyone gently that thousands of Blackthorn employees should not suffer delays because of one executive's mistake. His calm only deepened Sloane's discomfort because she had wanted him to raise his voice, to give her something to dismiss as bitterness from a man still nursing old wounds from their divorce, and he refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, Grant offered her a choice with no anger behind it at all. She could leave the aircraft exactly as she had just ordered him to do, or she could sit down and conduct herself like the executive she claimed to be. Because the Seattle meeting could not wait, Sloane chose to stay, sinking into her seat with far less certainty than she had walked in with. Grant did not take the largest chair in the cabin, the one usually reserved for the person everyone assumes matters most. He returned instead to his familiar seat by the window, opened his laptop, and resumed working as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Curious and unsettled, Sloane leaned toward a young flight attendant and asked quietly how long Mr. Holloway had owned this particular aircraft. The attendant answered without hesitation that this was the 7th jet in his private fleet, spoken as casually as someone naming a favorite coffee order. Sloane felt something cold settle behind her ribs as she understood for the first time that the $80 million cabin she had just ordered him to throw out of was nowhere near the full measure of what he owned. On the folding table in front of her sat the investment proposal she had rehearsed for 6 months, its cover page bearing a single line she had somehow not registered until this exact moment. The potential investor was listed as Holloway Meridian Strategic Holdings. Quietly, without alerting anyone around her, Sloane sent a message to her assistant on the ground, asking for everything the firm could find on Holloway Meridian within the hour. What came back over the next few minutes rearranged everything she thought she understood about the man across the aisle. The company owned 14 private aircraft, operated 3 full maintenance centers across the country, and held a portfolio of patents built around predictive engine failure technology that airlines had quietly licensed for years. Analysts valued the company north of $2.3 billion, though its ultimate beneficial owner was shielded behind a family trust so tightly structured that even seasoned reporters had never managed to attach a face to the name.
Sloane still tried to convince herself there was another explanation, that Grant might simply be a legal figurehead, a trustee managing assets that belonged to someone else entirely. She shifted her tone, softening it into something almost warm, and asked him why he had never told her about any of this during their years together, as though the omission were the greater offense. Grant reminded her, without malice, that when their marriage ended, he was still testing his first prototype in a rented hangar with more debt than equipment, and that she had walked away long before any of it proved itself. He added simply that he owed no accounting of his fortune to a woman who had already decided he would never build one. Sloane tried to reverse the blame, accusing him of hiding money deliberately so that history would remember her as someone who had abandoned a rich man rather than fled a failing one. Grant answered that quietly too, reminding her that when she left, the bank had already sent notice on their house and that their daughter needed a parent who stayed. He did not raise his voice while saying it, and the absence of anger let the truth land harder than any accusation could have. Beside them, an executive named Miles Keaton began quietly reconsidering years of stories Sloane had told about her ex-husband. The truth, as Miles was beginning to understand, was a man who had worked through nights building technology while raising a daughter alone, without complaint and without an audience. Still unwilling to fully surrender the narrative she had built for herself, Sloane offered one last dismissive remark, suggesting he simply got lucky selling a piece of software to the right buyer at the right moment. Grant, without looking up from his screen, pulled a live data feed showing a warning buried inside the flight's own maintenance logs, a fault Blackthorn's own technical staff had overlooked entirely.
He identified the anomaly in seconds, the kind of instinct that comes only from years spent inside systems rather than boardrooms, and Reese, listening from the cockpit doorway, confirmed every word of it. For the first time since boarding, Sloane understood that whatever Grant Holloway had become, luck had very little to do with it. Holding the investment proposal she had prepared for a stranger she assumed would never truly examine it, Grant asked her, in the same even tone he had used all morning, whether she understood exactly who would decide if her company received $400 or collapsed without it. Sloane insisted, with what little authority she had left, that the final decision belonged to the Holloway Meridian board, not to any single man sitting on a private jet. Grant closed the folder in front of him and told her without theater that he was the chairman of that board and that there was no vote taking place today that did not run through him first. There was nothing left for her to deny. The entire flight, she realized, had been arranged by Holloway Meridian itself so that Blackthorn's leadership could present its restructuring plan directly to the very investor holding its future in his hands. For 6 months, Sloane had prepared to impress a mysterious billionaire she had never met, without once suspecting that the billionaire was the same man she had once called a failure in front of his own daughter. Grant did not cancel the meeting or delay it until they reached solid ground. Instead, he asked her to present it now, 35,000 feet above the country she had spent years trying to conquer. Sloane opened with the numbers designed to dazzle: an 18% reduction in operating costs, the planned sale of 2 maintenance centers, and an increase in executive bonuses once the deal closed, treating each cut as an accomplishment rather than a wound inflicted on people who had spent decades keeping aircraft safe. Grant, who understood better than anyone in that cabin exactly what those workers did and why their experience could not simply be replaced, asked her plainly who would be accountable when the maintenance chain inevitably failed without them. Sloane answered that personnel were always replaceable, a phrase that struck Grant harder than she could have known, because it echoed almost exactly how she had once treated him and their daughter when a more glamorous life called her away. Buried inside the financial appendix, Grant found $86 million routed to a consulting firm whose function nobody in the room could clearly explain. Sloane brushed past it quickly, insisting the decision belonged entirely to Comrade Blackthorn and had nothing to do with her. Miles Keaton shifted in his seat, uneasy,
remembering the afternoon 8 months earlier when he had first noticed the same consulting firm's name attached to a transfer he could not explain, and how he had said nothing then, out of fear for his own position. Grant asked, without raising his voice even slightly, to see the original unedited data behind every figure in the presentation. When Sloan suggested he likely lacked the financial background to interpret structures this complex, Grant calmly identified 3 miscalculations in the growth forecast, 1 concealed liability, and a clause that could leave the company's pension fund unable to meet its obligations within 18 months. Miles Keaton, sitting across the cabin, quietly confirmed that every correction Grant made was accurate. While Sloan sat frozen beside the folder that had just betrayed her, a secure message arrived on Grant's phone from Dana Whitlock, his lead counsel, informing him that investigators had finally identified who had signed off on the falsified maintenance reports buried inside Blackthorne's books, and that the signature belonged to Sloan Harlington herself. 12 years earlier, Grant had been an aviation engineer working out of a hangar he rented by the month, pouring every dollar he had into a system designed to predict engine failure before it could become catastrophic. Sloan believed in him once, in the early years, before the weight of unpaid bills began to erode whatever patience she had for a dream that refused to pay rent on time. It was Conrad Blackthorne who first pulled her into his orbit, offering her a taste of private jets, luxury hotels, and rooms filled with people who spoke in numbers with more zeros than she had ever imagined for herself. Long before any of that, Blackthorne had approached Grant directly, offering to buy his early technology for a fraction of its worth, on the condition that Grant sign away certain safety verification steps in exchange for lower production costs. Grant refused outright, unwilling to trade verified safety for speed, a decision Sloan at the time considered proof that he cared more about principle than about providing for his family. That single refusal became the fracture point of their marriage, the argument neither of them ever fully recovered from. She left not long after a failed funding round left them nearly broke, walking away while Piper, only 7 years old, stayed behind with her father because there was simply no other choice to make. Those early years had not been easy on anyone, least of all Piper, who grew up falling asleep to the sound of her father typing at the kitchen table long after her bedtime, surrounded by printouts covered with equations she would not understand until she was old enough to study them herself. Grant remembered those nights clearly, the cold coffee, the heater that never quite warmed the back room where he worked, and the particular loneliness of building something nobody believed in yet. He had told himself then that failure was simply data, another input to be studied rather than feared, and he had carried that same steadiness with him ever since. Less than a year later, Grant's prediction system caught a catastrophic failure forming inside a cargo fleet's engine array before it could ever become a headline.
And that single contract became the foundation on which Holloway Meridian was built. He kept his identity quiet, not out of shame or spite, but because he refused to let old headlines about a broken marriage follow his daughter into every classroom and every friendship she tried to build. Back in the present, Grant asked Sloan directly about the signature on the falsified reports, and this time she did not deny it, only insisted she had been following Conrad's explicit instructions. Grant asked whether Conrad had also instructed her to describe 2,400 human beings as an operational burden, and Sloan had no answer for that at all. Desperate, she reached for Piper as a shield, reminding Grant that they had once been a family, and pleading that he not destroy the career of the mother of his child. Grant stopped her immediately, refusing to let their daughter be used as leverage, pointing out gently that Sloan had already missed most of the years that mattered by claiming she was always too busy for them. As if summoned by the moment itself, Piper called her father from her dormitory to ask a quick technical question about an engine design assignment, and Grant's voice shifted instantly into something warm and unguarded, entirely unlike the composure he had shown all morning.
Sloane heard every word, but said nothing, because Piper had no idea her mother was sitting only a few feet away, listening to a closeness she herself had never managed to build. Piper's question that day had been about torque tolerances, a small technical detail from a homework assignment, and Grant walked her through it patiently, the way he had walked her through countless questions since she was small enough to sit on his lap in the old hangar office. There was no performance in his voice, no awareness that anyone else was listening, only the plain warmth of a father who had never once needed an audience to be present for his child. That short, ordinary phone call revealed more than any boardroom confrontation could have, proving that Grant had built an empire to prove anything to Sloane at all, but to give his daughter stability and to protect the people who had once trusted him with their safety. Before landing, Grant gave her one final opportunity, a single choice with no room for negotiation. Tell the entire truth before the wheels touched Seattle soil, or continue shielding Conrad and share equally in whatever came next. Still convinced her loyalty would be repaid, Sloane chose Conrad, certain that protecting him now would somehow protect her later. Minutes afterwards, a video call connected on the cabin's private screen, and Conrad Blackthorne's voice filled the space with the particular coldness of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Telling Sloane bluntly that if Grant discovered anything at all, she alone would be the one who had signed every document. Unaware that Grant sat directly across from her, Conrad instructed Sloane to secure the investor's signature before the aircraft landed, no matter what it took. He went further, ordering her to erase every trace connecting the company to the $86 million transferred through the unexplained consulting firm, his tone leaving no room for hesitation or conscience. Grant raised a single hand, signaling everyone in the cabin to remain silent while the call continued, allowing the aircraft's own legally disclosed recording system to capture every word without interruption. Conrad, growing careless in his certainty, revealed that the consulting firm was in fact controlled by a private Blackthorne family trust, a vehicle designed to quietly move personal assets out of reach before the larger company collapsed under its own debt. He explained, almost proudly, that because Sloane's signature appeared on the paperwork, any investigation would find her name first and likely stop there. Sloane sat frozen, absorbing the reality that the man she had served loyally for more than a decade had already built the exit ramp meant to leave her stranded in his place. She thought of every early morning she had spent drafting memos in his voice, every holiday she had missed to be reachable for him, every time she had told herself that loyalty upward would eventually be repaid in kind. None of it had ever been a partnership at all, only an arrangement that lasted exactly as long as she remained useful and not one moment longer. The cabin around her seemed to tilt slightly, though the aircraft itself flew perfectly level, and she found she could not look at Grant, could not bear to see whatever expression was waiting on his face. Then Grant leaned into frame, and Conrad's tone shifted instantly, sliding into forced warmth, as he insisted the entire conversation had simply been an internal misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Grant asked him plainly about the $86 million, the pension fund exposure, and the falsified maintenance figures, refusing to let the moment slip back into pleasantries. Conrad dismissed him as a fortunate engineer who lacked the experience to run anything resembling a global corporation, certain that a man who owned a handful of aircraft knows no real threat to a dynasty like his. Grant did not argue the point. He simply told Conrad they would speak again at the conference and ended the call without another word. Once the screen went dark, panic finally cracked through Sloane's composure, and she offered to hand over every internal document she had in exchange for Grant's silence about what he now knew. Grant refused the trade outright, explaining that his goal had never been to destroy or rescue her career, but to protect the employees and shareholders who would suffer if the wrong people escaped consequence. Miles Keaton admitted quietly that he had kept copies of the original unaltered reports for months, suspecting wrongdoing, but too afraid to lose his position to ever come forward. Grant promised without hesitation that anyone who told the truth honestly would be protected.
A promise Sloane realized she had never once offered to anyone beneath her. Slowly, she began to see that Grant was using his power in a way she had never imagined possible, not to punish the vulnerable, but to shield them. and the realization unsettled her more than any accusation could have. Still searching for a way out, Sloan proposed transferring her personal shares to him, resigning quietly, publicly blaming Conrad alone, or altering her testimony to avoid scrutiny altogether. Grant asked for none of it. He asked only that she tell the plain truth, without embellishment, and without recasting herself as a victim of circumstances she had willingly chosen, reminding her gently that the truth, however uncomfortable, was the only thing left that might still be worth something to her. Eventually, she handed Dana Whitlock access to the internal data vault, and what Dana uncovered there was worse than either of them had expected. Conrad intended to declare bankruptcy shortly after receiving the investment, then quietly reacquire the company's most valuable assets through an entirely separate shell entity. Dana worked in near silence for the better part of an hour, cross-referencing timestamps and share company filings, while the rest of the cabin waited, until she finally looked up and said quietly that the paper trail told a clearer story than anyone had wanted to believe possible. Then Grant revealed something Sloan had not anticipated at all, that Holloway Meridian had spent the last 6 months quietly acquiring the majority of Blackthorn Global's outstanding debt. It meant Conrad was not merely asking Grant for an investment, he was already answerable to him as his largest creditor. As the aircraft began its descent toward Seattle, Grant looked at Sloan and told her that when the cabin door opened, Conrad would expect her loyalty exactly as before, and that she should be careful about disappointing him too soon. At the private terminal in Seattle, a line of polished vehicles waited beneath gray skies for Conrad Blackthorn's arrival. He stepped onto the tarmac surrounded by lawyers and communications advisors, entirely unaware that the man walking calmly behind his own delegation controlled more of his company than he did. When Grant appeared first at the base of the stairs in his plain jacket, Conrad assumed, just as everyone else had that morning, that he was some technician traveling with the flight. In front of gathered reporters, Conrad ordered security to remove him from the area reserved for executives, and Sloan stood frozen, recognizing in that instant the exact scene she herself had staged only hours earlier. Grant did not react at all. Captain Reese simply handed the ground staff a signed confirmation of aircraft ownership, and the security detail retreated at once, without further explanation needed. Still unaware of the full scope of what he was facing, Conrad continued to believe Grant was little more than a charter pilot's employer who happened to be along for the ride. Inside the hotel hosting the investment conference, Conrad ordered Sloan to proceed with the presentation exactly as rehearsed, as though nothing on the flight had ever happened. He announced to a room full of shareholders that Holloway Meridian had all but agreed to commit $400 million, presenting the deal as a formality rather than the uncertainty it actually was. Sloan glanced toward the back of the room where Grant sat quietly among the crowd, and for the first time in her career, she understood exactly how it felt to be used by someone powerful and then discarded the moment convenience demanded it. While publicly praising her contributions, Conrad had already sent instructions to legal counsel, preparing her termination the moment the funds cleared, a message Dana had already intercepted and secured. Grant offered Sloan no instructions about what to do next. He simply let her choose alone between finishing the lie for a few more hours of borrowed comfort or telling the truth and accepting whatever followed. She began the presentation exactly as written, walking through growth projections, margin improvements, and the language of restructuring she had rehearsed for months. When she reached the section detailing workforce reductions, her voice caught and she stopped entirely. Rather than reciting the falsified numbers one final time, Sloan admitted in front of the entire room that the figures behind her had been deliberately manipulated. Conrad interrupted immediately, suggesting loudly that the stress of an old divorce had finally caught up with her, and ordered her microphone cut before she could say another word. Grant rose from his seat and walked toward the stage without hesitation. Conrad turned toward him with contempt, asking what right a man who merely owned a private aircraft believed he had to interrupt a shareholder meeting of this magnitude.
Before Grant could answer, the conference chair, Evelyn Wycliffe, stood and addressed the room in a voice that carried to every corner of it, introducing him not as a stranger, but as Grant Holloway, chairman of Holloway Meridian and the controlling creditor of Conrad's entire company. The room fell into silence so complete that the hum of the projector seemed loud by comparison. None of the executives who had laughed at Grant on the aircraft that morning dared to look in his direction now. Rows of shareholders shifted in their seats, some reaching for phones to check whether the name Evelyn had just spoken carried the weight she claimed it did. And within seconds, it became clear that it did. Reporters near the back of the room began typing furiously, their questions about a routine investment pitch replaced entirely by something far larger than any of them had walked in to expect to cover. Sloane remained near the side of the stage, no longer part of the presentation, but unable to make herself leave, watching the man she had once dismissed as unremarkable command a room that had, until minutes ago, belonged entirely to Conrad. She thought briefly and painfully of every dinner party where she had described her marriage to Grant as a chapter she had outgrown, and wondered how many of those same people were sitting in this very audience. He kept his remarks brief, offering no boasts about personal wealth and no theatrics, choosing instead to let the evidence speak for itself.
He laid out the falsified financial statements, the unexplained $86 million transfer, the scheme threatening the pension fund, the concealed maintenance data, the planned bankruptcy designed to strip value from the company, and the explicit instruction to make Sloane the sole face of every wrongdoing. Conrad denied it all, calling the accusations a coordinated hostile takeover dressed as a concern. Dana stepped forward and played the recorded call from the aircraft, supported by banking records and internal correspondence that left no room left to denial. Faced with undeniable proof, the board voted on the spot to suspend Conrad from his position immediately. Grant announced that Holloway Meridian would not proceed with the original $400 million commitment under the terms Conrad had proposed. Instead, he offered a new path forward, one built around protecting the pension fund, retaining essential maintenance technicians, eliminating inflated executive bonuses, and creating an independent safety oversight board answerable to no single executive. He made it clear that ordinary employees would not be made to pay for decisions made far above their heads. With bankruptcy as the only remaining alternative, the shareholders accepted his terms without objection. Conrad was escorted away to face his lawyers and the beginning of a federal inquiry, his downfall arriving not through violence or spectacle, but through documents, recordings, and the quiet courage of people who had finally stopped being afraid of him. A reporter near the front asked Grant how it felt to have his own ex-wife try to remove him from his own aircraft only hours earlier. He did not use the moment to embarrass her further. He simply answered that the aircraft itself had never been the point, and that what mattered was the belief, so easily held by people with power, that a person without visible wealth did not deserve respect. Somewhere behind him, Sloane lowered her eyes, hearing in his answer an accusation she had never expected him to make out loud, and finding it harder to bear precisely because he had not tried to hurt her with it. After the conference had emptied and the cameras had gone quiet, Grant caught up with Sloane in the hallway and asked, almost desperately, whether everything he had built over the last decade had been engineered as a slow, patient act of revenge against her. The hallway outside the ballroom had emptied of reporters by then, leaving only the hum of an air conditioning vent and the distant clatter of catering staff clearing tables meant for a celebration that had never happened. Grant told her plainly that he had stopped living for her judgment many years earlier, back when survival mattered more than proving anything to anyone. Whatever he had built, he said, had never once been an answer to her doubts, only a response to the responsibilities in front of him at the time. Sloane apologized for abandoning their family, for dismissing the years he spent building something from nothing, and for using her position to humiliate him in front of strangers who meant nothing to either of them. She suggested, quietly and without much hope, that perhaps they could try again, that enough time had passed for old wounds to close.
Grant refused clearly and without cruelty, explaining that forgiveness could exist for his own peace of mind without ever requiring him to restore trust that had already been spent. Removed from her position as chief strategy officer, Sloan avoided bearing the full weight of Conrad's crimes only because she had ultimately cooperated and provided the evidence that exposed him. Still, consequences followed her regardless. She was required to publicly acknowledge her role in the falsified reports, return the bonuses she had received under false pretenses, cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation, and step down from every remaining position on the board. She would have to rebuild whatever career remained to her without the protection of the Blackthorn name behind her for the first time in years. Grant made no effort to shield her from these outcomes, nor did he use his influence to make them worse than they needed to be. He simply allowed the consequences to match the choices she had made along the way. Before he turned to leave, Sloan asked quietly whether Piper would ever be willing to see her again. Grant told her that decision belonged to their daughter alone, and for the first time, Sloan understood that neither money nor apology could ever purchase back the years she had already let slip away. Through the terminal window, she watched the Gulf Stream being prepared for its next departure. The same aircraft she had once believed proved she belonged to a higher class of people than the man she had married. Only hours later, she finally understood that the jet had never been the most important thing in that story at all. What she had truly lost was not access to wealth or status, but the trust of a man who had once believed in her completely back when neither of them had anything at all. Several weeks later, Grant returned to the same airfield with Piper beside him, on her way to begin an internship at the Holloway Meridian Technical Center, where she had specifically requested to be evaluated like any other applicant. Grant agreed without hesitation, because he had no interest in his daughter riding on his surname instead of her own ability. Piper already knew what had happened with her mother, and although she was not yet ready to forgive her, she had agreed to read the letter Sloan sent, leaving open, however faintly, the possibility of something rebuilt slowly over time. Blackthorn Global was eventually renamed and restructured from the ground up, preserving thousands of jobs while granting its safety division far greater independence and authority than it had ever held before. Captain Reese teased Grant about finally trading in his aging pickup truck for something more befitting a man of his fortune, and Grant only smiled, saying the old truck still ran perfectly well, that it had never once failed to start on a cold morning, and that loyalty, in his experience, deserved to be returned rather than traded away for something shinier. Before boarding, a new employee who didn't recognize him politely asked him if he needed any assistance finding his gate.
Grant thanked the young man sincerely instead of brushing past him, understanding, better than most people in his position ever would, that a person's true character is revealed most clearly in how they treat someone they believe has nothing to offer them in return. Piper settled into the seat beside her father, pulling out a battered notebook filled with her own calculations, and for a while neither of them spoke, content in the easy quiet that only exists between people who have already survived the hard years together. She asked him eventually whether he had ever doubted himself back in the days of the rented hangar, and Grant admitted that he had, more times than he could count. But that doubt had never once felt like a reason to stop. Below them, the city of Seattle grew smaller, and then disappeared entirely beneath a soft ceiling of cloud. The boardrooms and headlines and reporters shrinking into something that no longer mattered nearly as much as the two people sitting in that cabin. Grant thought, not for the first time, that the version of success worth having was never the one that needed an audience to feel real. As the Gulf Stream lifted off into the gray Seattle sky, Grant did not look down at the city below like a man celebrating victory over the people who had once dismissed him. He was simply a father who had held on to his principles, protected the people whose lives depended on his decisions, and proven, without ever needing to say it aloud, that the truest form of power is never becoming the person who once looked down on you.